Alright, so I'm going to talk for a little bit about a book I read recently. George Eliot's Silas Marner, The Weaver and Raveloe. A few things to get out of the way real quick. George Eliot, not actually born George Eliot, but Marian Evans, on the 22nd of November, 1819, died 61 years later, 22nd of December, 1880. Real quick, though, the pen name, a few things about it. George Eliot, or Marian Evans, anyway, had a pre-existing career in other forms of writing. She's a translator, a historian, which is what her preferred sort of nomenclature there. She did a lot of critical essays, journals, etc. Didn't really want that work coming in and affecting her fiction or how people perceived her fiction, that she started writing later in life. She also had a bit of a perverse sort of, at least in the Victorian sense of the term anyway, marriage with a man who was already married to a woman who was already married to another man, and they had this strange kind of open marriage thing where a lot of different children of different, I don't know, it was kind of strange, but, you know, more power to her. And she developed a male name, of course, because it was easier, or I guess I should say it was harder to be taken seriously as a writer, as a woman, and it was something that was, you know, judging a book by its cover. You see the males at the time thought that the women only ever really wrote romantic fiction, and they wanted something more serious, so she used George Eliot. A stronger name. A couple things, try to go fast here, about, in terms of background info before we get going on the book itself. It came out 2 years after Darwin published his Origins of Species, which I didn't really read much into that when I read the book. I didn't really go look for context. I kind of wanted to just have an open mind going into it, but going back and reading through it and reading different passages, it's easier to see exactly what kind of commentary the book is, and it's very, 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 it has a lot to do, not necessarily with Darwinian ideas like social Darwinism or anything like that, the theory of evolution by itself. It's more commentary on what society went through at the time, like how it could be possible to live godless in a universe that may or may not have a god, or live potentially in a godless universe. And the main element that I want to kind of get at is the element of chance. And so Silas Marner, the main character of this book, believe it or not, is a linen weaver. He weaves linens 16 hours a day, every day of the week. To my knowledge, he doesn't respect any holidays. He just does this day in, day out. In terms of personality, he's very spider-like. He's described by Eliot at one point as looking constantly as if he's intensely focused on inspecting tiny grains of sand. So it's Eliot's way of describing the fact that he's really constantly focused or distracted on something very insignificant, or something that's seen as very insignificant to everyone else, like grains of sand, for example. So he just weaves linens constantly, excuse me, very spider-like, so that he can hoard gold. This is the one thing, enjoyable thing that he has in life, is hoarding gold. He has no anticipation of buying anything, of saving for anything. He just takes his gold, puts it in a bag, puts the bag in the ground, and digs it up at the end of the day. Or he doesn't want to buy anything, he just particularly enjoys the gold. And he's not portrayed to us, though, as a greedy sort of individual. He's very pitiable. He's referred to many times throughout the book as poor Silas. He actually does, though, however, have a reason for us to pity him. It turns out the reason why he's so distracted, and the reason why he's so single-minded and focused on weaving constantly, is because of a rather unfortunate past that he had. When he was a young man, he was a member of this really kind of bizarre cult, is how I would describe it, the Lantern Yard. It's reminiscent of a sort of really cloistered sect of Christianity, almost very gothic and kind of dark. when he was in the Lantern Yard, he did nothing but study scripture and do religious sorts of things, I suppose, day in, day out. And there was an old deacon who was sick, and they all took shifts taking care of this old deacon. Well, one day, Silas's best friend, William Dane, ended up framing Silas for something Silas didn't do. The old man's money was stolen. He dies. The book wasn't clear about whether or not it was natural, but Silas was actually framed for what happened to this old man. So what they do in the Lantern Yard is, there's no habeas corpus, there's no cops. What they do is they do what's known as drawing lots, which for the reader is akin to flipping a coin and then saying, God, take over the coin. Heads, he's guilty, tails, he's not. So it's supposed to be something that looks really like it's ordered, like there's something behind it, but what ends up happening is Silas is declared guilty by the lots. But he didn't do it. We as the reader know, because the narrator's telling us. Now whether or not the narrator can be trusted is, I think, kind of beside the point. And so what he does is he flees the town completely. He leaves the Lantern Yard and then goes to live in Raveloe to do nothing but weave for 15 years and completely forget about this part of his life. So we'll leave Silas alone for right now. We'll come back to him in a bit. The next character or characters that I want to introduce is the Cass sons. Godfrey Cass is the oldest son of the squire of this village, Raveloe, and Godfrey is fairly affluent. He is set to inherit squiredom. He's to become the next squire of this town, and the squires are in charge of doing things like levying taxes and whatnot. And so when we catch up with Godfrey, he is in a tavern known as the Rainbow, and he's arguing with his brother Dunstan. Now Dunstan is basically a scumbag. He gambles and drinks away all of his money. He swaps and bets and all that. And Godfrey was foolish enough to lend Dunstan money. So Dunsey, as he's called in the book, is a little easier to say that, takes money from Godfrey that Godfrey lends him, which was actually tax money that Godfrey wasn't supposed to give away at all, and Dunsey loses it, of course. So they're arguing, and then they end up settling on the selling of... Dunstan has plans, or wanted to tell Godfrey about, but kind of held back, about stealing Silas's, or the linen weavers, the old crazy hermit's money. Because, I mean, let's face it, he's a dirty, older guy. He doesn't do anything with the money that he spends all day making. Basically what ends up happening is Dunstan goes by Marner's cottage, and he wasn't there. So Dunstan goes in, looks for the money, finds it, steals it. So naturally, because all of this, Silas is fairly distraught. He's actually described from then on as extremely desolate, and we as the reader can kind of see him go through all the stages of grief, or not all of them completely, because it's kind of cut short at one point. But I want to spend a tiny bit more time describing Godfrey, because he's basically the second most, or tied for the most important member of this character cast. So he's basically got some issues, and his primary issue is that he is the opposite of Silas in his mindset, and that's that Silas is willing to just sit there and work and do nothing but that day in, day out. He's extremely single-minded. That's what he relies on, whether he knows it or not. But Godfrey, being an affluent little kind of man-child, more or less, he worships what's known as favorable chance. He just basically sits around and waits for things to go nicely. And here's the manifestation of that, the symbolic side of that part of his life. He eloped at one point, which is bad because he's set to marry this incredible, beautiful woman, Nancy Lammeter, who's a few years younger than him, Godfrey being about 23 or 24 or something like that. But this marriage is set to take place, and it's conflicting because Godfrey has a secret marriage and a secret child. He was drunk one night and eloped, realized that he messed up, and so he just left. And what he has basically done with this baby and this mother, who's actually an opium addict, is they're just over there somewhere. They're in a different town, and he just kind of leaves them be somewhere else. Doesn't do anything, he just hopes that they'll go away. It even says at one point in the story that he hopes that he just kind of wants them to die, more or less. He is not out of maliciousness, he just doesn't want that happening because he wants to be able to marry Nancy, but he doesn't want to confront his problems. He is at a fancy schmancy ball on New Year's with all the rich people in town. Nancy's there, it's all great. And he looks out the window at one point, and he sees the weaver, the old linen weaver, carrying his baby, his secret baby. Like, what? Right? So he freaks out, but tries to keep it cool because it's a secret baby. What actually happens, though, in a chapter previous to this, the mother, Molly, wanders into Raveloe because she's finally had it with Godfrey's lack of presence and decides to confront him because she knows he's very rich and that he can solve all her troubles, and so she trudges through the snow, basically, right up to Raveloe, takes the last bit of her opium, and passes out in the snow, basically, with the baby. So she dies there, but the baby gets up, walks around a little bit, sees a light in the distance, walks towards the light, ends up being Silas's little cottage. And the interesting thing that happens is Silas is still mourning for his gold, and actually the reason why the child was able to walk in was because he left the door open because he thought that as mysteriously as his gold had disappeared, it would just reappear in his house. And so he would go out and look out the door and nothing, then go back and sit down and weave and cry over that, and then rinse, repeat. Old little baby walks in with this golden hair of Godfrey's, and he immediately, he's kind of weary, he thinks that this is his gold. And he picks it up, and it's kind of moving around, and it's warm, and he kind of, lurches back and realizes that it's a baby. So the next thing he thinks immediately is that it's the embodiment of his gold come back to him. And he resolves immediately that this is his goal now. That this is the thing he has to do. He has to take care of this child, he has to make it his, and this is the final part of the story that I can really branch away from without spoiling major things. Is that this is the next character that's introduced, is Epi. Is what he decides to name the child. This becomes his daughter, and he raises her. So I have a couple things to go over. A couple of articles, in fact. Try to be fast with this. This is by Bruce K. Martin, and it's from the Texas Studies in Literature and Language, Volume 14, Number 3, and it outlines the character relationship between Silas and Godfrey, which is necessary to sort of think about anyway, because the way that the characters are written about in Silas Marner, it's not like they're one giant group of things that's this perspective and then the other, so the reader kind of has to put things together. It's hard to make anything, really, of what each of these characters is doing for the story. It's called Similarity Within Dissimilarity, the Dual Structure of Silas Marner. Critics interested in Silas Marner have frequently discussed George Eliot's use of Godfrey Cass. Their principal theories include the notion that the story of Godfrey is primarily a negative analog to that of Silas. A second theory stresses what many critics see as the novel's air of unreality, closely related to allegory, which George Eliot makes tolerable to the modern reader by offering the Godfrey story in a wholly realistic vein. Finally, we have the idea that though offering Silas and Godfrey as representatives of differing worldviews, George Eliot rejects the beliefs of both and instead moves her characters toward an appreciation of human love absent in both their earlier creeds. All of these views have value for all recognize a structural problem in the novel which no searching analysis can ignore, and all at least partly demonstrate the novel's tightness of design. Yet none is wholly satisfactory, for in fastening upon some central contrast of effect, tone, or ideology between the two characters and their stories, critics have neglected important similarities and the relationship of their differences to such similarities. An examination of Silas and Godfrey in terms of both similar and dissimilar characteristics reveals a dimension of structural integrity in the novel hitherto ignored. George Eliot uses Godfrey as both parallel and foil to Silas to universalize certain assumptions about the moral nature and needs of man, while suggesting the varied outcomes of human endeavor. Okay, so that's a bit much, but basically what it's getting at is that Silas and Godfrey are both individuals who have their lives changed for the good or for the worse by the element of chance. And this is how I'm tying it in any way, is that that's their similarity is that's the focus of them as characters, but they have different approaches to it. So whereas Silas is simply just trucking along and going about his days, dealing with his problems by distracting himself from them, Godfrey doesn't have a distractor. It's not necessarily good to distract oneself from one's problems, but he just kind of ignores them and hopes that they go away, and they end up not doing that. So this is the foil/parallel nature of the relationship. This last one, called The Breaks in Silas Marner by David Sandstrom, from the Journal of English and Germanic Philology, Volume 97, Number 4. It has pertinence towards the Darwinian side of the story. This is about 3 or 4 pages into the article. Beer, who's another critic that David is referring to, Beer sees George Eliot's interest in chance as having been intellectually reinforced by Darwin's insistence on chance mutation as happening to fit or unfit an organism for its medium. Silas, published in 1861, 2 years after The Origin of Species, does address what is in several respects a Darwinian world. It depicts sudden, apparently random change. There are predators and victims. There is a struggle for existence entailing individual and societal extinctions. There is a tangled bank of personal and casual relationships, but no apparent grand design centered on humanity, let alone on any given individual. There is no discernible higher power directing events. Life's events are intertwined but stochastic. Like Darwin, and perhaps because of him, Silas Marner confronts higgledy-piggledy. And I don't know if I could have outlined it better myself, but to tie all of that in on a sort of closing note, the main difference between the citizens of Raveloe, everyone in the book, and us in real life is that we have a narrator telling us what's going on. There are a lot of strange things happening from any one of these characters' perspectives. Like, everything that happens story-wise in the book appears as if it could be significant in terms of divine intervention, you know, God giving, God taking away, that sort of thing. But we know from the narrator why everything is happening. It's just we don't have that in real life. We don't have that perspective. We're forced to realize that sometimes things don't make sense. There's some stuff that we know, and then there's some stuff that we don't know. And so this story is more or less Eliot's fictionized commentary on Darwinian evolution, both how it affected society, how we can move past it if it is particularly jarring for us, and how we as people are affected by the overall process, and kind of ties the two together. And that is a very, very lengthy discussion in itself, so I suppose I'll kind of leave on this airy, sort of unfinished note, and just say bye.